changed the channel while I was still watching it. Not asked me, not said excuse me, just picked up the remote from the arm of my chair. My chair. The one my husband and I bought at a little furniture shop in Muskoka the summer before he got sick, and switched it to a hockey game without looking at me once. I was 63 years old and sitting in my own living room in Barrie, Ontario, and my son-in-law changed my channel like I was furniture. That was a Tuesday in February. The ground outside was frozen solid, and the trees in the backyard were bare. And I remember thinking, as I sat there with my hands folded in my lap and said nothing, that I had been saying nothing for almost 2 years. Let me go back. My daughter. I will call her my daughter because that is what she is. That is the whole weight of it. She and her husband moved in with me in the spring of the year before that. She called me on a Sunday afternoon and said her husband's contracting business had hit a rough patch. That was the phrase she used. A rough patch. She said it would be 3 months, maybe 4, just until things picked back up. She said, "Mom, you have that hole upstairs." And I did. The upstairs had 2 bedrooms and a full bath, and my husband had been gone 4 years by then, and the house was quiet in a way that had started to feel less like peace and more like something I needed to fix. So I said yes. Of course I said yes. She is my daughter. I told them there was no rush on rent. I said we would sort that out when things settled. My son-in-law, he worked in residential renovations, decks and additions, that kind of work. He shook my hand at the door when they arrived with their moving truck and said, "Helen, we won't forget this." He called me Helen. I had always found that slightly odd. My daughter calls me Mom. He had never called me anything with warmth in it. The first few months were fine. Mostly, I cooked dinner on Sundays. He ate it. We watched television in the evenings, and he sat in the armchair across from mine, and we were polite to each other the way people are polite when they are sharing a space, and neither one particularly chose the other. By autumn, something had shifted. He started leaving his tools in my garage without asking. Not a few things. The garage filled up with his equipment, his materials, a trailer he parked half on my driveway. When I mentioned it, gently, he said it was only temporary and went back to whatever he was doing on his phone. My daughter was in the kitchen. She heard. She did not say anything. He started having calls at night, loud ones, standing in my front hallway or sometimes in the kitchen, business calls that went until 10 or 11. And when I came downstairs for water, he would look at me like I was the one who had intruded. I started going to bed earlier to avoid it. By January, the January before the February with the channel, he had stopped acknowledging me when I walked into a room. Not a nod, not a glance. If I said good morning, he might say it back the way you say it back when you're reading something and only half hear the words. My daughter noticed. I could see her noticing, but she would smooth things over in that way she had developed, changing the subject or making a small joke, and I let her, because she was my daughter, and I did not want to be the reason for difficulty in her marriage. Looking back, I understand what I was doing. I was making myself smaller, a little smaller each week, like I was trying to take up less air. The Tuesday in February. I had been watching a documentary on CBC about the Radeau Canal, just something I had put on after dinner, something quiet. My daughter had gone upstairs to do some work on her laptop. He came in from the garage, still in his jacket, and sat on the couch and picked up the remote and changed the channel. Hockey. He turned it up 2 notches. I sat there for a moment. I thought about saying something. I thought about how many times I had thought about saying something and then decided against it for the sake of keeping things smooth. And then I thought about my husband, who had sat in this room for 31 years and never once in 31 years made me feel like a guest in my own home. I said, I was watching that. He looked over at me. Not a long look. The kind of look you give something that has made a small, inconvenient noise. He said, "You have a TV in your bedroom?" I said nothing. I got up. I went upstairs to my bedroom, and I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark for a long time. My daughter knocked on my door about 20 minutes later. She came in and sat beside me, and she said, "Mom, he didn't mean it like that." And I looked at her. My daughter, who I had driven to piano lessons and sat with through chickenpox and held in the hospital parking lot the night she miscarried her first pregnancy, and I said, "How did he mean it then?" She didn't answer. I did not sleep much that night. In the morning, I got up before anyone else and made coffee and sat at my kitchen table and looked out at the backyard. There was a cardinal on the fence, the same fence my husband had built the summer his mother came to stay. I watched it for a while. I thought about the house. I had paid off the mortgage 11 years ago. The property was mine, free and clear, assessed at just over $700,000, which in Barrie in those years was a reasonable family home, nothing extravagant. My husband's life insurance had come through cleanly, the TFSA accounts were in order, and I had my pension from 30 years teaching at the elementary school on Dunlop Street. I was not a woman without resources. I had simply been behaving like one. I called my sister that morning. She lives outside of Kingston on a property with a little guest house in the back, a converted garage her husband had done up nicely before he passed. She said, "Come." She said it the way she always says things, without fuss, just the word and the meaning behind it. Come. I drove to Kingston that Friday. I told my daughter I was going to visit. I did not tell her how long I would be staying. My sister and I sat on her porch in the cold with our tea, and I told her everything, not just the Tuesday, but the whole 18 months of it. My sister is 2 years older than me, and she has a way of listening without filling the silence with her own opinions until she's heard everything. When I finished, she said, "What do you want to happen?" I thought about that. Not what I was owed, not what was fair, not what my daughter would think. What did I want? I said, "I want my house back." The next week, I called a lawyer, a woman in Barrie I had used before for my husband's estate. I told her the situation, and she walked me through it patiently. My daughter and her husband were not on the lease. There was no lease. They had no tenancy agreement, no financial arrangement of any kind in writing. In Ontario, even without a formal lease, a person living in someone else's home can establish certain rights over time, depending on circumstances. My lawyer was clear-eyed about it. She said, "The sooner we act, the cleaner this will be." She drafted a letter, a formal notice laid out according to the Residential Tenancies Act, giving 60 days' notice to vacate the property. It was not hostile. It was not emotional. It was paper with a date on it and a signature from a lawyer's office, and that made it something neither of them could dismiss by changing the subject. I was not there when it was delivered. My lawyer arranged it. I was at my sister's, sitting in the guest house with a cup of tea, when my daughter called. The phone rang, and I looked at it, and I answered it. "Mom." Her voice was tight, in that way it gets when she is trying to stay controlled. "Mom, there's a man here. He gave us papers." I said, "I know. I asked him to do that." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're evicting us?" I said, "I'm asking you to make other arrangements. You have 60 days. That's plenty of time." She started to cry, not the soft kind, the hard kind, the kind that sounds like it comes from somewhere deeper than sadness, somewhere more like panic. She said, "How could you do this without talking to me?" And I said, "I have been talking to you for a year and a half. Every time I said something, you smoothed it over. I am done being smoothed over." I heard her husband's voice in the background. She didn't put him on. I was glad. She called again that evening, calmer. She asked if we could talk in person. I said yes, but not at the house, not yet. We met at a Tim Hortons near the highway, halfway between Barrie and Kingston. She came alone. We sat for almost 2 hours. I let her say what she needed to say, that she felt blindsided, that she wished I had come to her first, that her husband was, she paused here for a long time, that her husband was going through things, that it had been a hard year, that he wasn't himself. I listened. I did not argue. Then I said, I know he's been under pressure. I know contracting work is hard, and the last few years have been difficult for a lot of people. I am not asking you to choose between me and him. I am asking both of you to live in your own home. That is a reasonable thing to ask. She looked at her coffee cup. I said, I love you. That has not changed. But I am 63 years old, and I am not going to spend whatever years I have left tiptoeing around a man who cannot be bothered to say good morning to me in my own kitchen. She nodded, very slowly, the way she used to nod when she was a little girl, and she knew I was right but wasn't ready to say so out loud. They were out in 41 days, not 60. 41. My son-in-law had apparently found a rental property in Innisfail, a townhouse, and they moved in on a Saturday in early April when the snow had just melted off the grass and the yard was still that particular shade of brown-gray that comes before the green. I drove back to Barrie on the Sunday. I parked in my driveway and I sat in the car for a moment before going in. The trailer was gone. The driveway looked wide again. I walked through the house slowly. The upstairs smelled like his cologne, which took a few weeks to fully clear. The garage had some oil stains on the floor that weren't there before, but the rooms were mine again. The quiet in them was mine. I went downstairs and I turned on the CBC and I found a nature program and I sat in my chair, the chair with the worn armrest, and I watched it at exactly the volume I wanted. I made tea. I watched the whole program. When it ended, I sat a while longer in the silence. Not the empty kind of silence, not the aching kind I had lived with after my husband passed. Something steadier. The quiet of a house that has stopped holding its breath. My daughter and I are still finding our way back to each other. It is slow. She called on my birthday and we talked for an hour and it was not easy, but it was real, which is more than the last 18 months of smoothing over had been. She did not bring him up. I did not ask. My sister says, give it time. She is usually right about these things. I have started having my neighbor Dot over on Thursday evenings. She lost her husband the same year I lost mine, and we have been meaning to do this for years, and somehow kept not doing it. We watch programs and drink tea and argue pleasantly about things that don't matter, and I walk her to the door at 9:30 and watch her cross the street to her own house. It is a small life in some ways, but it is mine. All of mine. In a way, it hasn't been for a while. There is a thing I know now that I perhaps always knew but had let myself forget. A home is not just a building. It is the particular arrangement of your things and your hours and your habits. It is where you are allowed to be exactly yourself, at the volume you choose, in the chair you chose, watching what you want to watch. When someone takes that from you, slowly, quietly, one small dismissal at a time, you lose more than comfort. You lose the thread back to yourself. I found mine again. If you are somewhere in that slow erosion right now, if someone is making you smaller one Tuesday at a time, I want you to hear this. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to change it back. You are allowed to choose yourself, even if it is the harder thing. Even if it costs something real. You are allowed to choose peace, and sometimes peace looks like a letter from a lawyer and 60 days' notice and your own television at your own volume on a quiet Sunday night in April. I think about that cardinal on the fence a lot, the one I watched the morning after he changed my channel. It didn't do anything remarkable. It just sat there, red against the gray February air, completely itself. And I remember thinking that even a small bird knows exactly where it belongs. I didn't always know that. Or maybe I knew it and spent a long time pretending I didn't, because knowing it would have required me to act on it, and acting on it would have cost something. That's the part nobody talks about when they say stand up for yourself. They don't mention that standing up means accepting a loss. A different kind of loss than the one you're already living, but a real one. My daughter cried in that Tim Hortons. That was real. That cost something. But here is what I've come to understand, sitting in my own chair, watching my own programs. In the house I paid for with 30 years of early mornings and lesson plans and parking lot duties and -20 weather, what happened to me didn't happen because my son-in-law was simply a difficult person. It happened because I taught him, slowly and without meaning to, that there were no consequences for dismissing me. Every time I stayed quiet, I confirmed it. Every time my daughter smoothed it over and I let her, I confirmed it again. He didn't arrive at my door disrespectful. He arrived uncertain of the limits, and I never drew them, and so he drew his own. That is a hard thing to admit. Not because it means I was wrong and he was right, he was not right, not even close, but because it means I had more power in that situation than I allowed myself to use. I had the deed to the house. I had the pension. I had the lawyer's number in my contacts. What I didn't have for too long was the belief that my own comfort in my own home was worth protecting. There's a kind of quiet wisdom that comes with getting older, if you let it. Not the wisdom of knowing more facts, but the wisdom of knowing which things actually matter. I spent 18 months managing other people's feelings at the expense of my own dignity. That was not kindness. Kindness that erases yourself is not kindness. It's just fear wearing a more acceptable face. What I did when I finally acted was not dramatic. I didn't shout, I didn't make a scene. I sat at my kitchen table, I thought clearly about what I owned and what I was entitled to, and I made a phone call. That's all it took. The clarity to think it through, the honesty to name what was actually happening, and the steadiness to follow through even when my daughter cried and I wanted to take it all back. Those 3 things, knowing right from wrong, thinking it through with a clear head, and holding the line when it's hard. I don't think they're separate qualities. I think they work together, and I think there's something you build over a lifetime, not something you're simply born with. I built some of mine in 30 years of teaching other people's children. Some of it I built in the years after my husband died, and I had to figure out how to be a person on my own again. And some of it, honestly, I built in those 41 days. I have my house back. I have my Thursday evenings with Dot. I have the volume exactly where I like it. That's enough. That is genuinely enough.